Fellow hunters and gun owners, as we see the threat of firearms confiscation approaching us and increasing over time, do we have a blind spot that we're suffering from? A blind spot on the central issue of private property ownership as it's defined by our Constitution.
What's your language?
Hello and welcome back to the Waiting Native Chronicles. I'm going to cover a subject today that's quite important. It's I would say controversial also in terms of the scope that it covers. I know there's a lot of people that are really tired of the cancel culture and victim creation that we're undergoing as a society nowadays, and this gets close to that, but it really is a long-standing old subject for Canadians that I really think needs to be brought into focus. It's not something frivolous, and it really does have application to our continued rights to own firearms. Over many years I've had interactions with fellow gun owners and hunters and organizations, and it's always been a little frustrating for me because it seems that they are often of two minds when it comes to the subject of ownership of their firearms. In some ways they want to have their cake and eat it too when it comes to the subject of property rights, because right away on the other hand I'll hear them complain very vociferously about the problem of Indians having all this land and all these rights and things like that. But you know, I think these two subjects are very closely related, and the two groups do depend on the same bedrock principles in Canadian law. So what I would like to do in this video, if you don't mind, and hear me out on this, just take your time, calm down. Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about treaty rights and stuff like that. Some of you may have your minds made up on it already, but I think if you listen through to this, you'll see that the two subjects are very closely related. Because what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at what are the principles in Canadian law, the ones that both we depend on and also the native peoples. That basic foundation that we depend on and is one that's been long established in British law from the founding of Canada and the Royal Proclamation of 1763. And it has always been the case that we have a right to our own property, that the government cannot come along and confiscate that. Now, it would be very sad if we were happy to have that right, but when it suits us and when it profits us to decide, well, we're not going to apply it in this instance. You know, you can't really do that with law, and you can't do that with life either, being of two minds. So it may involve having to resign yourself to the fact that not everything will go your way when it comes to upholding the law and the basic principles behind the law. Because if you allow this principle of ownership to be degraded or ignored, then that will put you on a slippery slope, one that's very hard to crawl back out of. So what I'm going to do in this video, I'm going to try to tie this all together, okay? I want to take a close look at what those basic principles are in British law, the law that our law derives from, and look at the history of this country a little bit and see how that really affects us as gun owners, not just treaty rights, but the two are interlinked in a strong way. So let's just start off with a little look through the history of this country, how it was founded, and why it was founded in the way it was. It's sort of a coincidence that at this time that we are starting to fight for our rights to continue to own our firearms and not have them taken away from us, that British Columbia is being faced with a rather similar problem. It's a problem that stems from, I think back in 1850s, they stopped making treaties with the indigenous people in their province. Basically, they couldn't afford to do it anymore, and British Columbia is a very rich province, rich in terms of resources. So the land that they wanted to have is actually quite valuable, and the native peoples there were aware of that too. So they weren't just going to sign away for nothing, and that eventually wound up with the BC government, after asking the Privy Council to help us with some more money and being told no, just saying, well, okay, no more, we're not making any more treaties. I think they made one in Victoria and one in another place, but that was about it. Very small part of the province got treaties arranged, and the rest of it, they just went ahead and basically did what they want, you know. So all these years later, you can't get away from the law, like they say, right? The native peoples have been very, I would say very patient and non-aggressive when it comes to pursuing the legal route. You may not think that now because you see a lot of it in the news, but traditionally that's really been the case to a large extent. They haven't fought back very hard. It wasn't helped by the fact that they were very poor and also often very ill-educated. So you know, what do you do when you want to fight against the government? Well, if you don't have the legal expertise, what you do is you hire a good lawyer, right? Usually you can at least do that. Somebody to stand up for your side of things, but you know, there was a lot of dirty pool being played back in those days, and when the Canadian government saw that this was going to start happening, they passed a law that protected them. They made a law that says that it was illegal for Indians to hire a lawyer. How about that? How would you like that, eh? So really, the fact that it's sitting here coming up now at this late date is no surprise at all. And the chickens are now coming home to roost. This is going to create a lot of turmoil, I think, in British Columbia. People are, I think they're hyping up the fears maybe a little bit too much, because in fact a lot of the province really is already basically owned by foreign interests already when it comes to logging and resources. So when you look at, well, let's put it in the hands of the local population, could it really be worse? I would think that maybe it would be better. So even with hunters too, a lot of hunters are very worried about the fact that they're going to lose all their hunting rights and rights to access the places that they've always gone. That's not necessarily the case either. Even in that, I kind of look at the way things are going in British Columbia, and with their shutting down the grizzly bear hunts and stuff like that, saying you can't take the hides, all kinds of crazy rules about, you know, wolves and all the bleeding hearts running the show over there. In a way, can it get any worse? I mean, I have a strong feeling that the native peoples would probably manage things a lot better than the BC government, if you ask me. So anyways, that's just kind of a little preamble to show you where we're at right now, because we have, on the one hand, if the time of this video, at least, we have the bill C-21 coming along. This is a real threat to our right to own, continue to own property that we've rightly obtained. And then we have, on the other hand, we have the natives in BC basically being upset about the same thing, because what it boils down to is, at one point in history, the Canadian government just went in and took their property. So yeah, that all this stuff is tied into the same principle in Canadian law that we're going to take a look at, and I think having an improved understanding and knowledge on this subject is going to pay dividends for us. And maybe we should link hands a little bit more with our Indigenous brothers and sisters. Now, I may be a little bit biased. You might say I'm wearing a, my wife is Native, but that should be an advantage, because you quite often people have views they've developed about Native people that are really very skewed by the way the media presents them, or just other people they know present them, and there's a lot of backwards thinking about it. Natives are really quite progressive people, and they're often very different from what people fear that they are, let's say. So let's start by taking a look at how these treaties were originally handled by Canada, and why they were handled in the way they were, because it's actually quite interesting. So let's go back a few hundred years here. The British at one time, before the United States was invented, they took over North America. They had to fight it out with the French and the Spaniards as well. And they overcame them, and they then instituted their own system. Now, their own system was one which, just like in India and countries in Africa as well, for instance, what the British did is they didn't just come in and take everybody's land from them. No, what they did is they replaced the governments in those lands. They didn't dispossess the people of their property. So that's something very important to keep in mind, and it really explains a lot why some people might wonder, why did they bother signing all these treaties? Now we're stuck with these treaties and obligations and blah, 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 Well, that's the way it was done by the British Empire. They had a system where they would take over the government, but they would then institute courts, and those courts then were designed to ensure that people could retain their property and not have it stolen from them. That was British law, and we saw that put in writing with the 1763 Royal Proclamation. And when it comes to property rights, one of the essential rights that goes along with that is the right to inherit or pass down your ownings and your property down to your descendants, right? So if you're wondering why these treaties are the way they are, and the way they continue to last, it's because the property that the land that was signed over through these treaties was something that they needed to be able to hand down to their children. So they were, according to the terms of the treaty, the inheritance applied. So that's very central, and it's really the same sort of thing we're facing with the government's efforts to take our property. Is in some instances they're saying, well, you can have it, but you can't hand it down to your next generation, and that's really a violation of the principles of British law, along with the fact that British law puts in place courts to protect us from the government taking, or anybody else taking, our property. It's worth noting also that, unique to Canada, I believe, the British, when they made their treaties with the Indigenous peoples, they not only did it in a way to respect property rights, for the most part, except for, I guess, BC, right? But in addition to protecting property rights or respecting those rights, they also included hunting and fishing rights, and I think that's something that we'll come back to later in this video. This is very unique for Canada. There's no other country that I know of where the colonizers gave guarantees like that, and those have significant repercussions, I believe, when it comes to arguing our rights to continue to hunt. I don't think hunting is ever going to be outlawed in Canada as a result. Another interesting effect from the treaties that were signed with our First Nations people is the guarantee of environmental protection to a large degree, something that wouldn't have occurred to the same extent otherwise. Because when I was just mentioning that Canada is unique in the fact that not only were treaties signed to exchange, certain rights and benefits for the land, but always in all these proclamations and in the Indian Act and in the treaties, it was always emphasized and repeated over and over again that this includes hunting and fishing rights. This is very important for us to keep in mind as Canadians, because when it comes to the environment, and especially the further back you go too, there's so many opportunities to destroy and damage the environment of this country for narrow interests. Politicians could be corrupted. Big moneyed interests could influence things inordinately to the detriment of the local people and without any thought towards the future. And what the treaties have done and our Constitution has supported is made the Indigenous peoples really, in a very real sense, stewards of the land of our country. Now, as current events show, there's some frustration with that, but we should temper that a little bit with knowledge that at least there are local people who have a definite interest in the environment being preserved, that are having a say when decisions are made that can affect the environment. So it's quite a unique aspect of our Canadian system, one that you don't find in the United States. These same kind of guarantees are not existent in other countries. Now, just to make it clear what I was talking about when it comes to environmental protection that occurs as a result of the treaties, I want to point out that, in case you haven't caught on to it, the reason for our native peoples having such an influence in this area is because of the guarantee of hunting and fishing rights. And the courts interpret that as protecting the right to hunt and fish. And you cannot go and destroy the environment in such a way that hunting and fishing is impacted negatively and say that you're upholding those treaty rights for hunting and fishing. If there's no environment and there's no clean water, you don't have any hunting and fishing rights because there's no animals in there. So just want to be sure you kind of understand that these are very significant restrictions on what the provinces can do, for instance, and the federal government, because these treaty rights are written into are part of our Constitution. So they, as being that they are at the height of Canadian law, so that means they override lower laws made by municipalities and provinces and so forth. So really important to us as hunters, I think, and we don't always realize how much we've benefited from that. Well, so I think we've kind of covered a lot of this now. You might wonder, why did you make this video? It's just like to talk or what? Well, one of the reasons I want to cover this is I think it's an overlooked aspect when it comes to the situation we're in. And there may be some reason for that too. I don't want to be too cynical about it, but quite honestly, if let's say you put yourself in the position of the head of the Canadian Firearms Association or the CCFR, I think they're good people and all that, but they are running organizations and they are trying to please their membership, and they certainly don't want to alienate them. And I feel that it kind of falls to an individual vlogger like myself to bring up these subjects, because I'm not afraid of losing my membership if I get into treaty rights, which perhaps some people in these organizations might want to avoid, which is why I call this video the third rail when it comes to gun rights. It is a combination of two things that are perhaps divisive to some extent, not for everybody, but for some, that they feel very strongly about native rights being too liberal in this country, or then we have of course the BC situation and politics in general. It's stepping a little bit broad when it comes to our normal considerations, but it is important to recognize these things, and I think we need to equip ourselves with a fuller understanding of Canadian law, even in cases where some people may not feel it totally benefits them. But in the long run, in the overall, laws that protect private property benefit us all. We really have to know our rights. This is a different situation we're in here than in the United States. In the U.S. it's easy. You just point to that Second Amendment there. It says it right there that we have the right to bear arms. But in Canada, it's a somewhat more nuanced argument that we have to make. And we really lose a lot of ground if we forget what our history is and what our laws were based on. And that prime issue is the protection of property rights. That is how the British began this country. As I said at the beginning, they came in, they replaced the governments. That's the way they did things, but they did not take away people's property. And to ensure that people's property was not taken away from them by the government or anybody else, that's why they put in place courts. And that's the British system. It's the system that we rely on to make our argument to keep our property. The government has no right, if we haven't done anything wrong, they have no right to take our property. And there's no clearer example of their restriction in that regard than the fact that when they came into this country, they could not just come in and take the land away from the people who were living there. They just couldn't do it. It's contrary to the laws that are in our current constitution as well. So we have the courts that are in place to protect us, and that's where we have to carry our case, both the native peoples and also gun owners, as things are turning out recently. So I hope you enjoyed this video and gave you something to think about, even if you do disagree. I hope to see you back next time, and for the Weighted Native Chronicles, God bless.
때 내가 개호지 이게 나지 그 교자